Chapter 6 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 6. After a lapse of 4 years, during which he had as completely vanished out of the memory of Stillwater as if he had been lying all the while in the crowded family tomb beneath the South Church, Richard Shackford reappeared one summer morning at the door of his cousin's house in Welch's Court. Mr. Shackford was absent at the moment, and Mrs. Morganson, an elderly deaf woman who came in for a few hours every day to do the housework, was busy in the extension. Without announcing himself, Richard stalked upstairs to the chamber in the gable, and went directly to a little shelf in one corner, upon which lay the dog's-eared copy of Robinson Crusoe, just as he had left it, save for the 4 years' accumulation of dust. Richard took the book fiercely in both hands, and with a single mighty tug tore it from top to bottom, and threw the fragments into the fireplace. A moment later, on the way downstairs, he encountered his kinsman ascending.
"Ah, you have come back,"
was Mr. Shackford's grim greeting, after a moment's hesitation. "Yes," said Richard with embarrassment, though he had made up his mind not to be embarrassed by his cousin.
"I can't say I was looking for you. You might have dropped me a line. You were politer when you left. Why do you come back, and why did you go away?" demanded the old man, with abrupt fierceness. The last 4 years had bleached him and bent him, and made him look very old. "I didn't like the idea of Blandmann and Sharp, for one thing," said Richard, "and I thought I liked the sea." "And did you?"
"No, sir. I enjoyed seeing foreign parts, and all that."
"Quite the young gentleman on his travels. But the sea didn't agree with you. And now you like the idea of Blandmann and Sharp?"
"Not the least in the world, I assure you," cried Richard. "I take to it as little as I ever did."
"Perhaps that is fortunate, but it's going to be rather difficult to suit your tastes. What do you like?"
"I like you, Cousin Lemuel. You have always been kind to me, in your way," said poor Richard, yearning for a glimmer of human warmth and sympathy, and forgetting all the dreariness of his uncared-for childhood. He had been out in the world, and had found it even harder-hearted than his own home, which he now idealized in the first flush of returning to it. Again he saw himself, a blond-headed little fellow with stocking down at heel, climbing the steep staircase, or digging in the clay at the front gate, with the air full of the breath of lilacs. That same penetrating perfume, blown through the open hall door as he spoke, nearly brought the tears to his eyes. He had looked forward for years to this coming back to Stillwater. Many a time, as he had wandered along the streets of some foreign seaport, the rich architecture and the bright costumes had faded out before him, and given place to the fat gray belfry and slim red chimneys of the humble New England village where he was born. He had learned to love it after losing it, and now he had struggled back through countless trials and disasters to find no welcome. "Cousin Lemuel," said Richard gently, "only just us two are left, and we ought to be good friends at least."
"We're good enough friends,"
mumbled Mr. Shackford, who could not evade taking the hand which Richard had forlornly reached out to him.
"but that needn't prevent us from understanding each other like rational creatures. I don't care for a great deal of fine sentiment in people who run away without so much as a thank ye."
"I was all wrong."
"That's what folks always say, with the delusion that it makes everything all right."
"Surely it helps to admit it."
"That depends. It generally doesn't. What do you propose to do?"
"I hardly know at the moment. My plans are quite in the air."
"In the air?" repeated Mr. Shackford. "I fancy that describes them. Your father's plans were always in the air, too, and he never got any of 'em down."
"I intend to get mine down."
"Have you saved by anything?"
"Not a cent."
"I thought as much."
"I had a couple of $100 in my sea chest, but I was shipwrecked and lost it. I barely saved myself. When Robinson Crusoe—"
"Damn Robinson Crusoe!" snapped Mr. Shackford.
"That's what I say," returned Richard gravely. "When Robinson Crusoe was cast on an uninhabited island, shrimps and soft-shelled crabs and all sorts of delicious mollusks, readily boiled, I've no doubt, crawled up on the beach and begged him to eat them. But I nearly starved to death."
"Of course. You will always be shipwrecked, and always be starved to death. You are one of that kind. I don't believe you are a Shackford at all. When they were not anything else, they were good sailors. If you had only a drop of his blood in your veins—"
And Mr. Shackford waved his head toward a faded portrait of a youngish, florid gentleman with banged hair and high coat collar, which hung against the wall halfway up the staircase. This was the counterfeit presentment of Lemuel Shackford's father, seated with his back at an open window, through which was seen a ship under full canvas, with the Union Jack standing out straight in the wrong direction.
"But what are you going to do for yourself? You can't start a subscription paper and play with Shipwrecked Mariner, you know."
"No, I hardly care to do that," said Richard, with a good-natured laugh, "though no poor devil ever had a better outfit for the character."
"What are you calculated for?"
Richard was painfully conscious of his unfitness for many things, but he felt there was nothing in life to which he was so ill adapted as his present position. Yet until he could look about him, he must needs eat his kinsman's reluctant bread, or starve. The world was younger and more unsophisticated when manna dropped from the clouds. Mr. Shackford stood with his neck craned over the frayed edge of his satin stock and one hand resting indecisively on the banister, and Richard on the step above, leaning his back against the blighted flowers of the wall-paper. From an oval window at the head of the stairs the summer sunshine streamed upon them, and illuminated the high-shouldered clock which, ensconced in an alcove, seemed to be listening to the conversation.
"There's no chance for you in the law,"
said Mr. Shackford, after a long pause.
"Sharp's nephew has the berth. A while ago I might have got you into the Miatowana Iron Works, but the rascally directors are trying to ruin me now. There's the Union Store, if they happen to want a clerk. I suppose you would be about as handy behind a counter as a hippopotamus. I have no business of my own to train you in. You are not good for the sea, and the sea has probably spoiled you for anything else. A drop of salt water just poisons a landsman. I'm sure I don't know what to do with you."
"Don't bother yourself about it at all," said Richard cheerfully. "You are going back on the whole family, ancestors and posterity, by suggesting that I can't make my own living. I only want a little time to take breath, don't you see? And a crust and a bed for a few days, such as you might give any wayfarer. Meanwhile, I will look after things around the place. I fancy I was never an idler here since the day I learned to split kindling."
"There's your old bed in the north chamber,"
said Mr. Shackford, wrinkling his forehead helplessly.
"According to my notion, it's not so good as a bunk, or a hammock slung in a tidy forecastle. But it's at your service, and Mrs. Morganson, I dare say, can lay an extra plate at table."
With which gracious acceptance of Richard's proposition, Mr. Shackford resumed his way upstairs, and the young man thoughtfully descended to the hall door and thence into the street, to take a general survey of the commercial capabilities of Stillwater. The outlook was not inspiring. A machinist or a mechanic or a day laborer might have found a foothold. A man without handicraft was not in request in Stillwater.
"What is your trade?"
was the staggering question that met Richard at the threshold. He went from workshop to workshop, confidently and cheerfully at first, whistling softly between whiles. But at every turn the question confronted him. In some places where he was recognized with thinly veiled surprise as that boy of Shackford's, he was kindly put off. In others he received only a stare or a brutal no. By noon he had exhausted the leading shops and offices in the village, and was so disheartened that he began to dread the thought of returning home to dinner. Clearly he was a superfluous person in Stillwater. A mortar-splashed hod-carrier, who had seated himself on a pile of brick and was eating his noonday rations from a tin can, just brought to him by a slatternly girl, gave Richard a spasm of envy. Here was a man who had found his place, and was establishing, what Richard did not seem able to establish in his own case, a right to exist. At supper Mr. Shackford refrained from examining Richard on his day's employment, for which reserve, or indifference, the boy was grateful. When the silent meal was over, the old man went to his papers, and Richard withdrew to his room in the gable. He had neglected to provide himself with a candle. However, there was nothing to read, for in destroying Robinson Crusoe he had destroyed his entire library, so he sat and brooded in the moonlight, casting a look of disgust now and then at the mutilated volume on the hearth. That lying romance! It had been, indirectly, the cause of all his woe, filling his boyish brain with visions of picturesque adventure, and sending him off to sea, where he had lost 4 precious years of his life. "If I had stuck to my studies," reflected Richard while undressing, "I might have made something of myself. He's a great friend, Robinson Crusoe." Richard fell asleep with as much bitterness in his bosom against Defoe's ingenious hero as if Robinson had been a living person instead of a living fiction, and out of this animosity grew a dream so fantastic and comical that Richard awoke himself with a bewildered laugh just as the sunrise reddened the panes of the chamber window. In this dream somebody came to Richard and asked him if he had heard of that dreadful thing about young Crusoe. "No, confound him," said Richard. "What is it?" "It has been ascertained," said somebody, who seemed to Richard at once an intimate friend and an utter stranger, "it has been ascertained beyond a doubt that the man Friday was not a man Friday at all, but a light-minded young princess from one of the neighboring islands who had fallen in love with Robinson. Her real name was Saturday." "Why, that's scandalous!" cried Richard with heat. "Think of the admiration and sympathy the world has been lavishing on this precious pair. Robinson Crusoe and his girl Saturday! That puts a different face on it." "Another great moral character exploded," murmured the shadowy shape, mixing itself up with the motes of a sunbeam and drifting out through the window. Then Richard fell to laughing in his sleep, and so awoke. He was still confused with the dream as he sat on the edge of his bed, pulling himself together in the broad daylight. "Well," he muttered at length, "I shouldn't wonder. There's nothing too bad to be believed of that man." End of Chapter 6.